So today I'm going to walk you through a virtual dissection. Now, my understanding is that at Northwestern we have stopped using fetal pig specimens entirely, or any kind of fixed specimens using formalin. We've moved to either a grocery store dissection model or something like this, a virtual anatomy, virtual dissection model. And that's acceptable. I think there's nothing that's ever going to be as good as getting your hands on a cadaver, but science doesn't necessarily agree with me about whether it's more useful to do it yourself, see with somebody else. So for the time being, this is what we've got, and as long as this is what we've got, we might as well be working on human specimens rather than fetal pig specimens. So what I've done is I've gone to McGraw-Hill Connect, and we're going to walk through a number of different models. We have the study guide. I have it right in front of me, in fact, so that I can make sure I didn't miss anything. We have our study guide for this and the list of structures to know, and it's a nice end of semester overview. At this point, we've covered all of these systems, and it's a nice little review, and just to see it in situ, to see it in context. Now, for this list, we're going to focus on sort of this zone. I'll be using the cavities and membranes. We'll be talking about them. I'll be using the directional terms, but I'm not going to like point to something and specify directional terms. We actually do have in the virtual dissector, let's see, body cavities. It's just not very well represented. We're going to be going into each of these cavities. So you know these images, right? Abdominal, abdominopelvic, cranial, the mediastinum, pelvic, and so on and so forth. It's not a very strong representation for a virtual dissection. What's really more meaningful is actually going into these body regions. I guess I'll start with digestive just because a couple of reasons. One, it's in order. Two, because on your questions, I already made the sort of built-in integrated McGraw-Hill worksheet for this to help you review this content, make sure you're very comfortable with it more than anything. I've already made that assignment, and for some reason, the content that's connected to the digestive system is by far the weakest. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and start there. And you can kind of see here that it's very weirdly organized. So we'll go into the abdominal cavity. Let's do one of these. So let's kind of just start peeling back the layers, literally. So if this were a real-life dissection, you would probably do a sort of U-shaped incision, but we're close to an O-shaped incision, and you would reflect the skin of the body wall back in this direction, and you would have to reflect a structure known as the greater omentum. Let's see if I can there's that greater omentum that I'm talking about. One thing that you don't get off of plastic models is that you've got a big fatty curtain. It's hanging off of the greater curvature of the stomach, and so this also has to be reflected before you can really get a view into the intestines, small intestine, large intestine. You can already see the liver and the gallbladder, which this is a very large gallbladder. Something's going on there. Normally we kind of have to peel up that liver to try to see a gallbladder on a cadaver. This might have been artificially inflated to be able to see it. It's very large. I wonder if there's stones in it. Okay, here is a stomach right here, which you can tell because, like I said, that greater omentum is a fatty curtain and it's hanging off of that stomach there. Omentum's not on your list, just so you know. So let's get rid of that omentum. And this is, we call it the abdominal cavity, but it's also the peritoneal cavity because the membrane lining it is the peritoneum. You do have the parietal peritoneum on the walls and the visceral peritoneum. And that visceral peritoneum is going to cover everything, including these mesenteries right here. So that's another thing that popular media gets wrong, is your mesenteries, your small intestine is suspended by these things called mesenteries. It's kind of like the sleeve right here. So it's wrapping all the way around, and then that membrane is then attached to the posterior body wall. So these are suspended to the posterior body wall. They're anchored there. So if you've ever watched like a horror movie and, you know, somebody cuts like down here to disembowel a person and their guts just spill onto the floor, that wouldn't quite happen. The intestines would herniate out, but they'd still have a force sticking them to the posterior body wall, so they're not going to fall on the floor right away unless you've got a problem with your mesenteries. I like to call this better living through anatomy. You can figure out exactly what the horror movies get wrong. There's an episode of X-Files that gets this very wrong. It's back in the day. I guess nobody watches X-Files anymore. Okay, and again, your mesenteries aren't really necessarily on this list, but they're an important structure to recognize when all you've been looking at so far is plastic models. So let's go. Okay, so now we know that the small intestine and the large intestine are suspended in the mesenteries. Now I'll need to show you some small intestine here. And there's actually 3 parts of the large intestine. There's no button to highlight all 3 of them at the same time. So what you want is the ascending colon, followed by the transverse colon, followed by the descending colon. And from there it actually goes to the sigmoid colon, down to the rectum, which I don't think is represented on this particular page. But that whole structure is going to be the large intestine. And off of that, let's go back to ascending colon really quick. This one is not a view from which we can see the appendix, unless it's vermiform appendix. Vermiform appendix. Vermiform means shape of a worm. It's kind of shaped like a little worm. It's like early anatomists dissected into this cavity and saw this like wormy thing and named it vermiform, shape of a worm. And appendix is an appendage. It's like a little worm sticking off. And they didn't really know what it was for, and we have some ideas now about what it's for. It is not vestigial. As far as we can tell, it's going to store some bacteria, and it's going to make something called a biofilm that you'll learn about in microbio. And that's going to help you to replenish intestinal bacteria if you have an event like severe diarrhea or antibiotic usage that gets rid of your intestinal bacteria. All right, I'm going way too slow right now because I'm just talking about stuff, but that's what a virtual dissection is for. That's what the dissection is for, really, is to make some connections between these things. So I'm trying to go superficial to deep rather than do something alphabetically. I don't think it makes sense to do things alphabetically. So now we get to some structures of the deep body wall. And this little bit of what looks like chewed up hamburger meat here is the pancreas. And this is part of the small intestine known as the duodenum, or some people will say duodenum. And that's associated with the head of the pancreas. So notice that it's basically behind everything. If you have to take out the stomach to see it, you have to take out the small intestine to see it. It's in the back. It's a deep structure. We've even cut into the liver here to visualize the biliary apparatus. Here's the spleen over here. And again, for some reason, they didn't put the spleen in this view, which is weird. So the spleen is right there. This is the respiratory diaphragm, which is another thing that they have not felt like highlighting on this particular page. We can see the bile duct right here, but I don't think it's going to, is it going to? Yeah, it's going to highlight it. So this view actually is going to cut off part of the duodenum and pancreas to show you that the bile duct is going to meet up with the main pancreatic duct there. Okay, pancreas, spleen, stomach, tongue. So we've looked at most of the things we can see from this view. Let's look at oral cavity and pharynx. Yeah, this lateral view is pretty helpful. So this is a mid-sagittal view that we've kind of taken, they actually do it with a bandsaw, sorry, to this person to get a nice mid-sagittal section. In fact, it's very mid-sagittal. We've even got that nasal septum. We've got some other stuff going on there where this is obscured. Yeah, that's very, very midline. For some reason, they didn't bother highlighting the epiglottis, but the epiglottis is right there covering the larynx, which they are also not labeling on this view for some reason. We can get a view of the hard palate and the soft palate as well as the tongue from this list in particular, but those other things are on here. They just are not highlighted here. And of course the teeth. Those are lips. So you can appreciate that position that the palate has, separating the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. That's actually very important, and it helps you to understand some structures like cleft palate. So when somebody's lip is split congenitally, when they're born with a split lip, known as a cleft palate, it's generally not just the soft tissue. It extends back into the hard palate, sometimes as far back as the soft palate, and that's going to allow food into the nasal cavity. So it's more than just a visual problem. It's also digestive, respiratory, linguistic. It affects linguistic development if it isn't repaired early on in life. When the babies are developing the ability to understand and speak language, even babbling is affected by a cleft palate. Okay, where are we? We've got... That was most of it, actually. Tongue, gallbladder. Esophagus. Now, the esophagus is here, whereas the trachea, the airway, is right here. So that trachea airway is going to be anterior to the esophagus, which is really clinically relevant, because if you're going to put like a gastric tube in, you got to make sure it goes down this hole. But if you're going to put in some kind of air tube into the airway, ventilate a person, you got to make sure it goes in the air hole. So you got to know which one's anterior and which one's posterior. Those are really clinically important relationships. I think that was actually pretty good for the digestive system. So let's move on to the urinary system. And it's mostly focusing on upper urinary. So again, we've got into this cavity. We've gotten rid of the omentum, the small intestines. We're deep in the posterior body wall, which is to say this is retroperitoneal. So this is behind the posterior parietal peritoneum, the peritoneum of the body wall in the back. This is behind that membrane. So in order to dissect this far, they really didn't bother portraying it, but you actually have to get rid of another membrane to get to this. So here you have your right and left kidney. Typically, that right kidney is going to be a little bit lower than the left kidney. This doesn't show that very well because you got the liver on this side, and that tends to push that kidney a little bit further down. Veins are almost always superficial compared to arteries. So that's the vena cava, and those are renal veins, and that's the abdominal aorta, and that makes that the renal arteries, so deeper structures. I think there's another view where I can get those blood vessels highlighted, but I'm happy with just showing them to you. They always look like two tree stick figures, like from an early Disney animation, just like hanging out with each other, like legs right here, bodies, arms sticking into the kidneys right there. So body, arms, kidneys, legs. I always see it that way. I can't help it. So again, you do have renal veins and renal arteries on your list. They're just under cardiovascular structures. Urinary bladder is down here. Now, it'd be nice if they gave us a full view. There's not much more to see from this view. Maybe if we did, is there a mid-sagittal section? I think there is. Yeah, mid-sagittal section for female. So just a sagittal section. Remember, sagittal could be over to the side. Mid-sagittal means we got the midline going on. Urinary bladder, interesting. Okay, is right there. So that's actually going to be, I think, the pubic symphysis right there. And that's going to be the uterus. So it's actually pretty typical. What you got going there? She's got a little, is that a fibroid? Might be a fibroid. Something's going on right there. It's not supposed to be there. Okay, she's got a little tilted uterus, which is very typical. That uterus tends to tilt one way or the other. It's not typical for it to be oriented perfectly in alignment with the vagina. It's pretty typical. Okay. What else did we want to get aside from urinary bladder? So again, that relationship in the female reproductive and female pelvic regions is to say that the urinary bladder is going to be anterior to that uterus. And in the male reproductive, lower urinary male, urinary bladder is here. There's the urethra out the penis, and then there's no uterus or vagina in the system. So this is going to be the rectum back here, which is also on your list. So are we going to have We're not going to have rectum, but that's what that is. There's anus. Yeah. Okay. Cardiovascular structures, of which we've already got a couple. We've got renal arteries and veins. So, cardiovascular. Let's go ahead and start with thoracic view in general. Now, again, so this is where we do that classic Y incision that everybody knows something about from lots of medical dramas and CSI type things. So we get rid of the skin of the superficial body wall. From here we can appreciate the costals, the rib. This is mostly costal cartilage that you're viewing right now. You can see some of our major muscles of the anterior thoracic region. We've cut away quite a bit. We skipped a few steps. One thing that we do is we cut away the ribs. We do that with some gardening shears. So there's a lot of trips to Home Depot involved in dissection lab, not gonna lie. Those like small ones there, they have the little clippy thing that's shaped like that. Those are what's used to get rid of the rib cage. Anyway, you have the pleural cavities for each of the lungs. This will be the right lung, this will be the left lung, this will be the let's see, pleura. I think this is called the visceral. That's pericardium, sorry. I'm obscuring my own view of what I'm listing. Okay. So I went through these earlier so that I would have an easier time finding everything that I could from this view. It looks like we're in cardiovascular, not respiratory, so we're not going to be able to highlight pleura from this view. That's why. That's my bad. Okay, so let's go back to dissecting one layer at a time. And we're doing cardiovascular. So let's appreciate the fibrous pericardium and how that's actually adhered to the surface of the respiratory diaphragm. And we're going to get rid of that pericardium. So now we're viewing, let's do this so that there, it's no longer highlighted. So we've opened up the fibrous pericardium. We've got some pericardial fat that we're visualizing here. Isn't there... Let's go back here for just a second. You do have a thymus gland underneath your miscellaneous structures. This fat-looking deposit right here is what's left of the thymus gland in the adults. As you get older, your thymus gland gets smaller and smaller. It's an immune structure. It's a location where certain immune cells go to mature. When I'm teaching immunology topics, I talk about it like it's a dojo where you're going to train to be this like super cool martial artist who knows how to assassinate people in the nighttime. That's what your thymus is. It's a location for these things to develop. That's it. And they'll develop into things that can destroy invaders. So that's what that is. And again, it's not something that this program has labeled very well. It's not labeled in a lot of places. In fact, I had to search for it up here in order to get to the view where they actually have it. But I'm going to click back into this because I want to keep going on cardiovascular. So again, heart with the fibrous pericardium, thymus gland. You can see some of the branching vessels superior. So this to this mediastinum right here. And then we get into the pericardium. We've cut away some of the lungs as well. Now I could start to appreciate some more of this aortic arch right here. Let's do aortic arch. So aortic arch, that makes this brachiocephalic, this makes this left common carotid, and this makes this subclavian. For arteries, you only have brachiocephalic on the right. You do not have a left brachiocephalic artery. You do have left and right brachiocephalic veins tied into the brachiocephalic trunk. Oh, sorry, that's brachiocephalic trunk of the aorta. What I meant to say was right and left brachiocephalic veins tie into the superior vena cava. My bad, I misspoke. There we go. Superior vena cava. So that's symmetrical. The veins are symmetrical. The aorta is asymmetrical. This would make this the pulmonary trunk. Should be around here somewhere. Pulmonary trunk with pulmonary arteries on the right and on the left. Nice thing about this view is, again, if you're cutting into this and you haven't removed the heart, you can see that pulmonary trunk actually branch out into the lungs. The lungs are right there. So that's part of why when we remove this heart, we can't get those pulmonary arteries branched out anymore without getting deeper into this lung tissue. They're going to be cut off short no matter what you do. The aorta, you've got a choice. You can cut it here, and the dissection guides always have you cutting it as close to the heart as possible for some reason, or you could cut it here and get this arch and those arch associated arteries there, which would be more fun. We should have right and left jugulars. I think they did. It's the weird thing with how they did the alphabeticals on this. They did right and left for most things, but then they just went, oh, both jugulars, both internal jugulars. You could have done right internal jugular and left internal jugular. They just decided to not follow their own pattern. Made your lives a little bit harder. While we are here, let's go down a layer and recognize... we just got rid of the heart completely, didn't we? We can recognize the superficial structures of the heart. This is the right atrium. This will be the right ventricle. This will be the left ventricle. Left atrium is going to be tucked away behind that pulmonary trunk, so you're not going to get a good view. Left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle. There you go. We got the superior vena cava. Let's see if we can get the inferior vena cava. Vena cava, some people say it. Inferior vena cava. We've cut out the heart entirely to be able to see it from that particular view, and that's fine. Did I get common carotid? I think that's divided left and right as well. I did get the left common carotid right there. The right common carotid is a branch of brachiocephalic. See if I can get right common carotid artery. Yeah, so see how that branches. And now you've got subclavian on the right and you've got common carotid on the right. Let's put that layer back in and that layer back in. So if you're confused why this was the brachiocephalic trunk before, but now it's labeled for the right common carotid artery. It's only the carotid after it branches. See that? That's a pretty good connection. I'm happy with that. Okay, that was it for cardiovascular structures. On to the respiratory system, which I was trying to give you earlier because it's actually the same view. We don't want upper respiratory, we want lower respiratory. So once again, cutting into the thoracic cavity, exposing structures of the thoracic cavity, we can now see the right and left lungs, as well as the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. Now that parietal pleura, the reason they've highlighted the respiratory diaphragm is that that pleural membrane, the parietal pleural membrane, is covering all of these surfaces. We've just cut some of it away. One of those surfaces it's covering is the respiratory diaphragm. So we've cut away much of it. We've left just enough so that you can appreciate how it looks. So right lung and left lung, and we really have to get rid of that heart if we want to see the trachea, which is what we're looking at right now. Okay, here's trachea and here's inside of the trachea. So you have your blood vessels cut away. You had, remember, from your heart, the pulmonary vessels, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins. So this is posterior to that. We had to cut out the heart structures to get to that. So here's the trachea. Watch that trachea as I move this away. There you go. So that esophagus, remember, is posterior to that trachea. So it's posterior to all of this. That esophagus is going to keep going, whereas that trachea is going to stop. So the trachea is much shorter than the esophagus. What else do I want to say? Diaphragm, larynx. I think I needed that mid-sagittal view to get to the larynx. There we go. So there's that epiglottis that covers the larynx when you're trying to swallow food or water. So that effectively is going to keep you from choking every time you drink water or eat some food. So that's pretty important. Okay, I think the only thing I'm missing is a couple of lymphatic structures. We got a view of the thymus for miscellaneous structures, but we didn't get, and you can see that this is a really lacking list for lymphatics. Or sorry, I need endocrine. Endocrine? Endocrine. Endocrine is the one that's a really lacking list for endocrine structures. Now, it's on your list as adrenal glands. Ad means above. Another thing that means above is supra. So suprarenal glands and adrenal glands, they're the same thing. It's fine, I promise. The good reason to call them suprarenal glands is that they are served by suprarenal arteries and veins. They're always referred to as suprarenal arteries and veins. So by definition, this is the suprarenal gland. Now, this is divorced from all context, so I will go ahead and show you. There's the gland. It has a cortex. It has a medulla. Has these histologically distinct areas that release distinct hormones. But let's go back to urinary system just to show you. No, we don't want the kidneys. We want upper urinary. Let's go back to the kidneys. And you do have them in this view, I think. Well, they're here and here respectively, but they won't let us label them from this list right here. So they don't look like much when you're dissecting. In fact, this has already been cleared of a lot of what we refer to perirenal fat. Fat around the kidneys has already been cleared considerably to be able to view these. I kind of already talked about it, but the best way to find these is via the suprarenal arteries. Because they look fatty themselves, as you saw from the last view, and the fat around them also looks like fat. So when you're dissecting them out, it's really, really tricky to see where it stops being fat and starts being glandular. Again, a lot of glandy things don't look like much, like that pancreas, for example. Let's go back to digestive for a second and look at that pancreas. Abdominal cavity. Pancreas. Boop. So let's go ahead and there we go. So yeah, it doesn't look like a heck of a lot. It was actually my professors in grad school who said it looked like a piece of chewed up hamburger meat. So I'm quoting them. I didn't make that up. So they're not impressive looking, and if you're doing a compare and contrast to the fat around them, it's just mostly texture more than anything else. So I think we were in endocrine. No, we were in renal. We were in kidney, urinary, upper urinary, kidneys. Looking at our suprarenal or adrenal glands. And I think that's it. That is the entire dissection. Obviously, if this were real life, it would take a little bit longer. But when you do this on a fetal pig, it's about this rewarding. You get in pretty quickly, you explore all the structures pretty quickly, but you get a really nice integrated view of how these things are put together, how you get from one piece to the next. There's your psoas muscle back there. Let's put all of our stuff back. Not that you can do that in real life, but again, just go backwards. I think that'll do it. I hope you enjoyed this virtual dissection. Obviously, as long as you have McGraw-Hill Connect, you have access to all of this, and you can go look at any of these structures from a variety of different views, more than just the ones that I've shown them. I hope that this helped integrate all of these things together and helped you understand the positions, anterior, posterior, superficial, deep, medial, lateral, how these things interrelate to each other. That's really the goal, and I hope you had fun. Thank you very much.